Welcome to the today's session of Voices of Ecosystem. And I have a fascinating guest, and you will learn about him in a second, Taylor Dolezal. And Taylor, he's actually the head of ecosystem at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. And so he's an expert of the topic of business ecosystems and technology. And I'm sure we will learn a lot about how both topics are linked together. So Taylor, first of all, welcome to today's session.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really stoked to be here and just talk to you about any questions that you've got. Really, like you said, my name's Taylor. I'm the head of ecosystem at the CNCF, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, and I work with our end user community. So I'll go into detail about everything that our ecosystem culminates into, but we have vendor members, that's like clouds and other folks that are spinning up and reselling cloud native services. And then the end users are folks like Mercedes-Benz Tech Innovation, Airbnb, Apple, Intuit, and several others that actually use CNCF open source projects like Kubernetes or Prometheus to power their businesses. So really fascinating. I get to have wonderful conversations with folks just about every day.
Sounds great, and sounds really like you have a great passion for that. Maybe just one after question around your CV. How did you come to this position? So, what did you do before?
Yeah, so I've really had a really interesting career in terms of getting to focus on a whole bunch of different business verticals. In the past, I've worked for hospitals like the Cleveland Clinic. I've worked at American Greetings, which is kind of like more of a greeting card and hospitality company. But the last three jobs I've had were Disney Studios. So I live in Los Angeles, and that's how I got out here. Originally, was living in Cleveland, Ohio prior, and then went to HashiCorp after working for Disney at just about 4 years. Worked at HashiCorp for about a year and a half, and then finally landed at the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. I'd started contributing to open source back when I was working for Disney. Really at the Cleveland Clinic, but the job before Disney. But open source has always been at the top of my mind, and I've always been wanting to get into it. And so, right about 2017 or so, I took that plunge and just never looked back. It's been a wonderful thing for the CV, and I've met so many interesting people.
Sounds really interesting because, on the one hand, you work for big companies, big ecosystems. Now you're bringing that together in the organization you're currently working at. So maybe we can start with the first question in terms of how do you define actually a business ecosystem in your context, in the context of cloud native technology? So what is an ecosystem from your side, from your perspective?
The ecosystem within the Cloud Native Computing Foundation is interesting. I'd say I define an ecosystem as everyone really feeling, whether you know it or not, honestly, I guess, you're part of an ecosystem. If you start to think about the flows of how things are interconnected, so even with our distinction of the types of members that we have joined the foundation. So the CNCF, for those that don't know, is a open source foundation. It's a nonprofit, but people join with memberships if they want a little bit more engagement or want to shape or feed into the strategic parts by joining our governing board, either getting voted onto or becoming a platinum member, for instance, like Boeing or Apple, to help kind of shape the future in those respects. Then we have our technical oversight committee, which is another pillar. And then the final pillar of the CNCF are our end users. And those are the folks that I get to work with really closely. So even just within our distinctions of vendor members and end user members, right there is an ecosystem in and of itself. Because vendors are folks that are creating cloud native compute or networking features and services, essentially what they're hoping the end users will purchase. And then the end users are the ones that are pulling down these technologies, using them within their businesses, and then providing that feedback either directly to the cloud providers and the vendor members or through the projects that are getting adopted. So the CNCF projects, we have over 160 of them now at different levels of maturity. So we have sandbox, incubating, and graduated. And as you can see, just giving a really short whirlwind tour of all of these components, there's so many pieces that are within our ecosystem. And a whole bunch of checks and balances between all of those groups as well. And so again, really interesting space to dive into. I'm happy to dive in more extensively too if you have any
Yeah,
questions.
let's do it. Let's do it. I mean, you already mentioned a couple of benefits, but to drill it down, what are the real key benefits, what you're actually focusing at, or in other words, what happens if companies don't join your organization and your network? So how did they do it before? How do they do it without you? So what are you doing? What is actually the value proposition and the added value you are delivering? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and maybe also make a concrete example.
Absolutely. And so, no, completely valid question, right? I said open source, right? Doesn't that
Yep.
mean free? In many cases, yes. And people don't just jump into something usually, right? Before you go and you make dinner, you kind of you try to at least get a sense of what ingredients you need to put everything together. So,
Mhm.
in the sense of open source, that's something that's baked into the value proposition is that there's a contribution ladder or really an involvement ladder. So people have to pull it down and actually try it out and use it first before actually, that's the way we try to sell open source is pull it down and use it. It should be useful. That's
Mhm.
truly what we aim to have happen. We work really closely with maintainers on projects and try to eliminate the administrivia or the logistics and some of the more difficult parts as it pertains to managing a project. So we don't want folks to have to deal with legal problems and patent trolls and trying to figure out that space. The Linux Foundation is who we're under, and so as the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, we want to help you on that front. As it pertains to interacting with communities and getting coaching and guidance, if there's anything that we can do to help sponsor security research or just research in general to really help figure out things for the shape of our project, deal with dependencies, all of those things are things that we can kind of help out with and then eliminate the burden on maintainers. That's our end goal. So with people pulling these projects down and adopting them, that's also something we want to help facilitate, whether it's creating
Mhm.
more literature around how to use these different projects or guides, or providing research like projects in the past. We've done a CNCF radar to show which technologies are relevant within a certain space. And then, like I mentioned before, fuzzing and different security research is something that we're very adamant to do because we want people to be secure. You hear about things like Log4j, and for those that haven't heard, that was just a huge headache for many people in terms of some logging libraries in Java. And we don't want that to be the outcome within open source in our projects. So that's security is something we're firmly behind on that front. So as folks get started with these projects, they'll use them, they'll get a sense for them, and then there are different interfaces and protocols. Like within Kubernetes, you have the CSI, which is Cloud Storage Interface or
Mhm.
Container Storage Interface, and CNI, Container Network Interface. You have these protocols and interfaces, and then you have these projects that then adopt them. So you might use Kubernetes or you might not, and that's okay. And then you can have these binding points and these integration points across many different projects. So that's kind of how the ecosystem and that frame of mind comes to be, is that you have all of these tools that you can use within your company, and they are all free to get started. And then as you adopt them and put them deeper within your company and they become more of a foundation, like us, uh, then it's really important to drive that strategy and not be subject to what a certain cloud or end user or anyone wants to do. And so that's where we also come in and help, is we're a vendor neutral space. We facilitate discussions, and again, that we act as a certain check and balance as it comes to folks being able to get started with the cloud or really extend their business into the cloud and do so with confidence.
Is it, and if I'm listening to you, came up the metaphor of kind of the machine room of business, kind of you enable business in the not in the in the back office, but more really like in the machine room. you provide that interfaces are created, that they work, that people get to know how to do it when they want to collaborate across company borders, and so on and so forth. Is it a right description or right understanding, or how would you sharpen that?
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. There are, and I think that's the thing why open source has been so successful, especially for us, is because Kubernetes was donated by Google initially. That was our first project, and that was one of the sentiments of the folks that were working on it initially. That was what they were saying was, they wanted to stay at Google for the time being, but they just saw the Borg was something that was so great to have at Google, and all of these companies kind of had their own way of running things or software that was kind of locked within the company. And they said that was a huge bummer for them. That was a huge detractor to a lot of progress or good change that could happen in the world. And so after that got donated, the more and more companies started to see the value of donating projects like Kubernetes or working within that space, because then folks like Intuit or Mercedes can adopt these projects and then come to CNCF and other project specific meetings and talk about problems and hear new ones that they might have not even thought about. And so that's really the value, is getting to work in public and getting to work with this really smart and genius community on different problems and talk about solutions together too. It's really uplifting. That's what makes me so excited every day. I haven't had coffee yet, and I'm just waking up smiling because thinking about all those contexts and people truly working together to make wonderful things happen. It's a great space to be.
But the old question, also from an ecosystem perspective, open source versus like a closed source, yeah. Is it, for you, that's kind of two worlds which on the one hand collaborate also together, even fund the one or the other, yeah, as the Google example, and also I think other companies you mentioned. So how do you see that in the future? Is it more like a cooperation, coexistence, and maybe integration of open source and closed source, or how do you see that?
Yeah, so I think that personally, I don't think closed source is bad. I prefer open source, but at some level, you're going to have a project or something that you might run internally, and not everything needs to be open sourced, right? Like maybe I develop a command line tool or something like that. Toy apps are great things to have be open sourced, whereas certain tools might be dealing more deeply with your technology stack, or you might fork a project, or something might happen. So I'm not ambivalent to closed source because I think it can be useful in some cases. And then especially, there is always the I think what was it, was Subversion. That was a version control system before Git. That was one of the first features asked for, was how to make my branches private, because people were embarrassed of their code, which is kind of funny. Even starting a project, keeping it closed source until you kind of take a look at everything. I've seen people do as well. I've gotten a lot more confidence after working in open source about keeping something open there. But I think that it's different problems for different organizations, companies, or individuals for sure. But I really do see open source being that transformative thing in the future, as far as being a great place to start the discussion, and then really push through. It is difficult in some cases, especially when you start something new, but the CNCF, I think, has so much traction now after being around for just about 7 years now, that it's a lot easier conversation starter within that space, and I'm curious to see where it continues to go.
Yeah, and definitely in these times we have to talk about like the hot topic of artificial intelligence, and especially driven, of course, by the hype of ChatGPT and other programs. So how do you see that in the context of open source in the future? I mean, there are also diverse scenarios. I mean, that was I think planned, even ChatGPT as a foundation. Now we have the commercial branch of that, and we see the commercialization. And the question is, what role does it play so far for you in your organization and in your context? And how do you see the future of that? So will AI and really the mass customization of AI more an open source topic or a more a closed source topic? What is there your outlook of the future? Many questions, I know,
Yeah,
but
so, I love them all. I love them all. No, it's I think that personally, I'm a big fan of large language models and machine learning and all of these topics that are coming up recently. Um, I, I I find it fascinating, frankly. I think that there's a huge potential for folks to really get rid of a lot of the administrivia for ways for us to use it as a foundation and for other organizations and corporations to find useful ways to go about adopting it. I think even when it comes to just operational excellence, even if you aren't thinking about it in a technical sense, if you're automating those to-do lists that you create for yourself every day, or if there's something that you can, go and read something or act as a mock interviewer preparing for an interview,
Mhm.
all those kinds of topics are completely relevant and valid. I think that we're only obviously only scratching the surface right now. I think that's going to get really interesting in the next 5-10 years. But one of the fundamental questions that you brought up was, how does a foundation and an open source, this neutral body, really deal with that? Because we do have folks that have completely banned it outright.
Okay.
It emulates a lot of the early open source days, frankly. We're seeing the same kind of behavior where open source was banned for a very long time within certain organizations. And then once they started to see the momentum, they're like, okay, we're in. I remember when so I started on as a software engineer very early on in high school. It was always just something that really fascinated me. And I remember thinking back to Microsoft.net. I started in VB6, but seeing Microsoft.net come around and then think, like, if you told me then, oh yeah, Microsoft's going to open source this in a couple of years, I would have been like, no way. Think big things like that can happen. So I'm really curious to see where the world goes with AI and large language models, and just kind of like what the overall thought is, and ways in which people develop really interesting workflows with them from big organizations. With our foundation, so we're under the Linux Foundation, and that's primarily who we're working with on creating a decision for how we construct guidance for projects and
Mhm.
teams and companies to use AI in a lot of contexts. And so we haven't made that decision yet. It'll come later this year, but
Okay.
we've had a lot of great discussion around it. I can tell you it's not going to be like, don't use it. That's not at all what we're going to recommend.
Mhm.
But we are having a lot of conversations with project maintainers on ways in which they can have AI or LLMs cite the work that they do, kind of similar to AWS's Code Whisper, for instance. Um, we think that maintainers should know when they're accepting a pull request that's been generated in some part by AI, and those are kind of the topics that we're talking about. It's nice to have that citation and just understand, like, just because you might want to be a little bit more cautious about it. Maybe for some things you can be less cautious, but I think that's the biggest concern right now, is just giving maintainers that choice and ability to identify those things. It's less of a problem that AI is the one doing it. It's more around the data concerns, right? What are you putting into the
Yeah.
AI that could potentially get leaked? What kind of outcomes, or might something get snuck into a pull request that might end up hurting a project, whether intentionally or not? Those are kind of the questions that we're roiling with right now and speaking through. And it's fascinating discussions. If I love the choice that I picked in tech, but had I picked being a lawyer right now, would be a very interesting time too. I find it fascinating.
But that were really some great thoughts, and also from a personal human perspective, and that brings me almost to the end, because let's have the scenario in 5 to 10 years, and we don't have only AI, which is just helping us doing our life much easier, but which maybe also helps to take really serious decision about um, how we behave, which kind of medical services we use, how we live in general. So the question is, if everything is more and more automated, more and more AI driven, the question is then, should we better as a humans use open source, yeah? Or should we depend us to big players who are telling us what to do and how to do it? Of course, that's a difficult question, but what do you see there as tendencies? Because when we really think that to the end, yeah, and the power of AI and the power and what is then still human, of course we at the end we are responsible for our life, but still that will be more and more driven by like external codes. Yeah? And the question is if it's a company code, like a closed shop, or is it an open code which makes, at least on the one hand, it suggests us to be a little bit more independent. So are these the topics you are discussing, and do you already have there some answers, or is it just that you are now try to deal with the obvious questions you were just mentioning? So what is really the outlook for this AI topic in the future? What is your outlook for that? Yeah.
I think looking to the future, I think that is a constant discussion too. I think that looking at OpenAI, the original intent, as I understand it, was to give everyone their own LLM they could go train and really make it an extension
Could
of
be one
themselves.
idea. Yeah.
And so I really like that idea, and that when I first heard that, and I first heard about OpenAI back when it had started, it kind of like piqued my interest even back then, way before ChatGPT, because I was like, oh, that is interesting. It would be nice to not have to rely on a big tech company to really decide my path for me, like you said. And that's the goal of the CNCF around cloud native computing is, folks working on the cloud and building applications and things like that, is to give them that choice and then to make them feel like their voice is valid and actually show that, right? We've had many projects and other things where we've had people come in and state an opinion or show something and then change the entire direction of a project or cloud native computing in general. Really fascinating. And I think that will happen again with AI and LLMs and machine learning, because we have this, I think out of Google, there was a memo that was leaked that gets cited quite often, and it was OpenAI, or we have no moat and neither does OpenAI, meaning that there's, and then further going on to talk about how smaller LLMs, large language models, were going to be a lot more prolific in the future, because you could take something, and then I've even read stories where folks have spent like $100 USD and been able to train up an AI to do one very specific thing. So that's the thing that I think we'll start to see more of, are more specific language models for maybe creating recipes, based on what you take a picture with in your fridge, or just very specific things like, hey, I need you to write the shim code for my mobile application. We can start to give AI these tasks or these tools and then make them extensions of ourselves, much like, a calculator, for instance, and just have it specifically focused on things. And so I see that as being more the future, and I think that's where we'll have a lot of interesting conversations within all of our communities around what things are valuable, what kind of models and weighting, and then you start to get into the technicals, right? You always start at the high level, and then you really bring in the complexity after things get more established. So that's what I'm excited to see happen in this front, and then in a vendor-neutral space, like you said.
But does it mean, maybe another question, that you will be more interesting, more relevant, not only for companies, but also for us as individuals? When you think that thought further, at least that sounds to me. Is that the idea?
Absolutely agree. Yeah, I think that there is a lot of draw to within entities that I work with and groups that I work with. I think right now there is definitely, like, we only offer memberships for organizations. We don't have an individual membership at the moment, for instance, but Linux Foundation does, and I think the OpenJS Foundation does. There's a lot of different types of foundations under the Linux Foundation too, much like the CNCF has projects, but foundation project fundamentally different. I think that's going to really pull people in a way that they haven't been involved before, and really spark some good conversations there too. I think that even sharing ways of how you go about training things and just that knowledge sharing component, I think that's what really fascinates me. I love learning, love having discussions, and so I think that's going to be something that's really interesting conversation within the months to come.
Pretty cool. So I really could have this conversation continued for hours, but we, in terms of like listening friendliness, we have to end up maybe with an ultimate question, and it is a question I always ask to every guest in this blogcast. Coming back to the ecosystem perspective, so where do you personally integrate or act with an ecosystem mindset in your, maybe also in your private life? Is there anything where you would say, hey, here I'm also like an ecosystem person with a specific example or in a specific setting or in a general way?
Yeah, so I love thinking in systems,
Okay.
frankly. I think that so yeah, it's a perfect fit. It it's you know, if something people always say when there's outages, at least in the infrastructure world, you know, oh, it's always DNS. And I think that like you can apply that to communication with people. If you're not going to the same endpoint, if you're not speaking about the same thing, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have a rough time communicating. So what's really important to me is thinking about life in those ways, and I've just started taking lots of notes and really just trying to transform a lot of the ways that I think. And the way that I go about doing that is there's a little mini movement called the Project Knowledge Mapping books, and so they use things like I used to use Evernote to take notes, for instance. Now I use something called Obsidian, and that allows for a lot more interconnectedness with my notes. And so you have a little ecosystem right even in there. So there's a little pocket of folks that I learn from and different groups that I'll listen to and speak with, different discords. Even my notes are kind of an ecosystem. I'll have a way that things flow in and out, and then create what's called like creative exhaust in terms of my writing and other things that I'll do there too. So yeah, even in my personal life, even with my notes, there's a little ecosystem that exists, and it's something I love thinking about often. Is just what's the shape and what's the flow of all these things. I don't think anything it should exist in a static sense, right? It's nice to have that flow and that movement constantly. I think that's really important.
Cool. That's a really good closing remark, Taylor. Thank you so much for having you here. Thanks for this really great thoughts, great outlooks in the future. I think this is which is so important for also for the listeners out there to get some ideas, a picture of the future with experts like you. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Julian. This is great. I really appreciate it. Hope to see you again soon.